if you don't like the government, then you can leave. And the fact that you haven't left the government is either explicitly or implicitly legitimizing the government's rule over you. And this is why government actions that would normally be considered crimes, like especially theft and kidnapping, are not crimes, but instead drafts or taxes or whatever other name we want to call them by. This is the argument that libertarians come across all the time. And there's numerous problems with this. At least a few fallacies, a number of contradictions, and also an inconsistent application of the logic here. So, for starters, and I don't remember the Latin name for this fallacy. It might be post hoc ergo propter hoc, but I might be wrong about that. Basically, it assumes the very question under debate. It assumes that there is a valid social contract and that the state has control over you, and that the burden of proof is on you to somehow exit that. So if I come to you and say, listen, the place where you live, your home, that actually falls within the realm of my control, and so you owe me taxes, whatever I dictate, and if you don't like it, that's fine, you can leave. And then you say, well, you object, you say that there isn't such a contract. I can't assert, well, the fact that you haven't left proves that there is such a contract. No, that's the very thing that's being debated. You're just reasserting it as if it's a fact, but that's the very thing that we're trying to decide. But there's any number of other problems with it. One is it ignores the fact that states reserve the right to unilaterally set the terms of that fleeing. I mean, first of all, the fallacy of just assuming it's dead in the water. Okay, it's not an argument at that point. But just to illustrate how absurd it is, it's nice to go a couple steps further. The analogy that you can leave is false, because in reality the state sets the terms of your contractual negation. To make it sound, it makes it sound like you have a free choice that you can just drop it whenever you want, but the state will impose penalties on you, and you have no say over what those penalties are. Now, historically, many states haven't been that interested in whether their subjects leave, although it has happened. If we go back to the Bronze Age, for instance, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations, say Egypt, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they often complained about people leaving their areas. A lot of people didn't like being taxed and ruled over by Pharaoh or whatever, and they would leave to other states. There's actually a term for these. I believe it's an Akkadian term. It's called the Habiru. And one of the main things that these kings would talk about when they corresponded with each other was, there's a whole bunch of my Habiru in your land, and I want you to send them back. So there's that. A lot of states don't seem to mind. And of course, then there are the more draconian, infamous examples, say like East Germany or the Soviet Union, who, yeah, you can leave, and the price is you have to run a gauntlet of barbed wire, dogs, and guard towers. And the penalty, if you try and escape and are caught, is either death or violent imprisonment. Logically, the love it or leave it argument doesn't make any kind of objection to this. I mean, if we wanted to really have a sound love it or leave it argument, we would have to say, if anyone wants to leave, they should be free to do so, no questions asked. That would make some sense. But states never act that way. They will set conditions. In the United States, those conditions are financial penalties, relatively hefty ones. In fact, if you're very wealthy and you're famous and you leave, there's a good chance that you might be hit with some kind of punitive, specified penalty, as is the case with Eduardo Saverin. it hasn't actually happened, and I don't think that it will, but there was serious talk. But even if he isn't hit with a specific Savaronian tax, he's going to be hit with regular exit tax. And the United States is kind of unusual in this. The IRS basically looks ill on the people leaving, and they impose very heavy burdens. So the idea that it's a free choice in the specific example of the United States is completely false. And even in the more general world, it's always up to the state to decide what the barrier is. So it is a conflation of reality. It's an unrealistic representation of reality in the analogy to say just love it or leave it. Another problem with the "you've implicitly agreed" argument is that based on that criteria, every single government in history has met that criteria, and so is justified based on that logic in whatever they have ever done. Now, there are the most cliched examples here that, at the risk of, I guess it's now a fallacy to cite some of them, that's not really true, but let's just ignore the most blatant ones. But every single monarch ever meets the criteria of satisfying the implicit social contract theory. So, to return to the Bronze Age, for instance, if you don't like what Pharaoh is doing, and you don't want to spend your summers building a giant pile of stones so that he can take a shortcut to the afterlife or whatever bullshit they believed it was going to do, you can cross the Sahara Desert, and if you don't want to do that and abandon your entire livelihood, then Pharaoh has every right to expect you to do that. And shame on any selfish libertarian Egyptian who thinks otherwise. Those greedy anarchists who object when the richest man in history at the time, the Pharaoh, demands that a very poor person who can barely survive give him hundreds or thousands of hours of his labor unconditionally. Perish the thought. But it goes on and on. Every state ever has met this criteria. The kings, the King of England, the Queen of England, the czars, the Chinese emperors, they all meet this criteria. Under this criteria, there is no objection whatsoever anyone can ever make to any government. And if indeed your staying in a country is an implicit consent to the being ruled by that government, then there is no such thing as genocide or these things. We shouldn't consider these crimes because that's just how those governments have decided to rule over their people. And so just like we have words like taxation to justify theft, we should come up with new words, and the Holocaust shouldn't be the Holocaust, and it shouldn't be genocide. It should be called population recalibration or something like that. Something to soften so that we don't get confused and think it's a crime when obviously it's not a crime because all those Jews consented to what happened. And I said I wasn't going to use that example, but it seems to be the most dramatic one that maybe has some chance of jarring people's ideological inertia. They all consented to it because they didn't flee. The ones who fled, they didn't get Holocaust, so yes, they're okay, but the ones who stayed, no. So every state meets this criteria. But the other problem is other groups of people who attempt to do this very thing and fail or are in the process of doing it, they don't meet the criteria. So these people who make the love it or leave it, the government has an implicit, you've given the government implicit control over your life to rule over you, whatever it says. How many of those people support the secession of the southern United States from the northern United States? There are people who agree with the secession of the South. And there isn't any logical reason why those people couldn't be the same people who believe in social contract theory. I mean, there could be Confederal socialists out there who think that they believe social contract theory is valid and they support the South seceding. But in effect, they're mutually exclusive groups. In this case, we have millions. The population of the South is about 9 million, about 5 million whites, and the majority of the whites supported secession. There are many who did not. There are many who we can argue whether they had a say, like women, for instance, or disenfranchised men. But and there was a draft in the South. I'm not an apologist for what the Confederate government had done, but there was also great enthusiasm for opposing the Northern aggression against the South. And they formed their own social contract and their own explicit government, for that matter. As such, if you really believe in social contract theory, it would make sense then to support the South in these efforts, at least to some degree. But they never do. A more contemporary, there's other examples that we might use that weren't as dramatic, because nothing was as dramatic as the Civil War, but the Mormons, for instance. Thousands of Mormons migrated out to Utah in the 1830s and 40s and basically formed their own society. And of course out there was nothing that could be construed as U.S. government services. There were no roads built by the U.S. government. Back then there were no telegraph lines, no railroads, nothing. They built their own society out there in Utah. And it would stand to reason then that they could form their own social contract and have polygamy or whatever else they believed in. And that all you social contract theorist statists out there would logically have to accept that and say, hey, well, that's fine. They chose to do that voluntarily. They should be free. I don't think any of them would ever agree to that. In today's society, in New Hampshire, among the Free State people, they have what they call the Shire Society. This is actually an explicit, signed social contract. So there's no ambiguity about implicit agreement here. I don't know the details of what it says. It's been around for a couple of years now, I believe. Do the social contract people believe that the Shire Society is valid? I'm going to say all of them do not. Even though it ostensibly meets their criteria. Now, what if the Shire Society, the likely objection is, well, there aren't that many people in the Shire Society. I don't know how many are in it. My guess is it's in the hundreds. I might even be overestimating it. Maybe it's in the low thousands. I doubt it, though. But numbers are a matter, I mean, when it comes to democracy and society, numbers are a matter of concentration and orientation. So there could very easily be a neighborhood or a region, a town, a village, a county, in some cases, like in Utah, perhaps even an entire state, where the people there, some majority or some large group of them sign this new explicit social contract. Why wouldn't that be more valid than the very subtly implied one that has been around for 200 years, but no one, I mean, do the social contract theorists accept that? No. And we don't have to be as explicit about the Shire Society. Me and my libertarian friends could just go to a third-party neighbor and say, listen, this is our state, we have a social contract, you get to stay. But only on the conditions that we set. And if you don't leave, then you're agreeing to this, and you owe us whatever taxes we set to you. Would the social contract theory people accept this? No. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning. All this serves to do is legitimize the status quo, whatever that is. And so, even though logically it would allow for things like the Shire Society or the secession of the South or Utah or me and my 6 buddies or whatever, that would disrupt the current government and the status quo, and so they don't even pretend to accept it, even though logically they would have to. Now, the other problem with the social contract theory is that no state ever in history that I'm aware of comes anywhere close to even initially being some kind of social contract. I mean, right now there's kind of a reductio ad absurdum where they say, well, the social contract in the United States isn't now, but it was signed back in the Constitution days. That's when its legitimacy was created. That's when it started, and that it's just extended now through the ages. But The United States, and I think the United States had one of the more consensual, I hesitate to do that, one of the more consensual social contracts. There was more involvement of more people than is normal with states, but not as much as the majoritarian rhetoric of current political Democrats would accept. Another YouTube user on here made the good point of saying you should always ask people, I forget his name, really cute guy. He said you should always ask what majority, what number of votes do you need, what ratio of votes do you need to assert coercive authority over third parties? Because there's this kind of idea that if you get a majority of some amount, you are justified in what you're doing, and if you have a minority, you're not. What is the exact number that's required? And it's a really important question to ask, because if they can't provide a specific answer, then what they're advocating is completely arbitrary and subjective, and there's no reason to consider it rigorous or convincing argumentation. But if they do actually put a number to it, there's probably literally no examples in history that would meet that standard. So if you say a simple majority, that didn't happen with the United States. For starters, slaves and women had no say. That's more than half the population right there. Of men, many were children or too old and infirm or infirm in some other way. They're excluded. Then there are men who are just disenfranchised either because they don't own property or they don't own enough property or they have too much debt or too few assets. They're disenfranchised. So then you're talking about a relatively small set of the population. It varied by state in the United States, but we're probably talking somewhere around 15 or maybe 20% tops. But then only a majority of that actually voted yes, because a big part of that voted no. The anti-federalists were very popular in the United States. Some people say in absolute numbers that they were more popular. I'm not sure that we can know that with a great deal of certainty, but we have basically a majority of an electorate which is itself a tiny sliver of the country. And the United States, I think, had one of the more inclusive phases of state formation than pretty much any other examples. So it doesn't meet the majoritarian criteria. It's an elite clique. This is something that people who are otherwise wrong about everything else, a lot of these Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn types, are correct. We're talking about an elite clique of landowners. Now, I happen to revere some of them, especially people like Jefferson, and revile others like Hamilton, and have very mixed views about people like Adams or George Washington. But whatever we want to say about them, they were not a majority of the population by any stretch of the imagination. They were a ruling elite. And so by the majoritarian democratic philosophy, the social contract of the United States is invalid. Now this goes back, how do most states get their borders? It's not a series of we convince people to join a contract. It is conquest. It is conquest. The map on the world, those laws are drawn in blood and through war, directly or indirectly. For instance, in Africa, not every line there was happened because the current governments fought a war. But those lines were drawn because their European colonial masters did fight wars and sign treaties between each other. And then when they left, they divided up. So the borders are still derived from the sword. They're not derived from some social contract. So this theory, we might argue and say, well, hypothetically or theoretically, a social contract could or might have been formed. Maybe it's possible. But it's not the case with any governments that exist today. You know, if I said the social contract is valid because what if omniscient aliens from outer space came down and they were so wise that they would be able to draw up a governing document that would govern us better than anything we could ever imagine. Any libertarian who thinks they can handle their own life better is wrong because these omniscient aliens know more. and the document that they've drawn up, we are obligated to observe that in our own best interest. Maybe that's theoretically possible. Is that what happened? No. So it's completely irrelevant. So the social contract where people came together, blah, 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 it's completely irrelevant because that's not what happened. And actually when that does happen, like with the Shire Society, they don't accept it. Now the other thing is the absolute absurd. I hear this non sequitur that, well, implicit contracts are valid, and look at you stupid libertarians. When you go to a restaurant, you order food, and you have to pay for it, and you don't just walk out. And if you don't believe in the implicit contract, well, then you're against capitalism altogether. And a lot of these people think that they're so snide. They think they're being so clever by bringing this up. That's one of the dumbest analogies I can imagine. I agree that implicit contracts can be valid. They're a lot harder to enforce and work out if there's a dispute. I mean, if I say, hey, you can borrow my car, but make sure you put gas in it or whatever and you take care of it, and then you do and we don't have an argument, then it doesn't matter. If you give me the car back, I'm like, hey, there's a scratch, blah, 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 it's going to actually be kind of difficult for us to, or potentially could be difficult for us to decide for the dispute because we don't have something that is explicitly written out, unless we have a video recording of the contract. But going into a restaurant and ordering food is not analogous to being born in a state. When I go to a restaurant, I choose to go into the restaurant. I don't have to go into the restaurant. I don't have to move my house or any other bit of my belongings. When I go in, there's a menu with prices next to the things I might order. They don't just come out and slap a whole bunch of food on the table and then hand me a bill. I have to order the food first. And the prices are right there. They don't give me a form called a 1040 and say, listen, now since you're here, you have to tell us all the money you make, all the income you've ever earned anywhere, your total assessed value, blah, 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 how many kids you have, how many dependents, and when you're done, we're just going to come up with a number based on our own whim of what you owe us. Oh, and by the way, the nice cute guy with all the buttons who showed you to his room, to your seat here, if you don't do what we say, he's going to go out, he's going to impound your car, and he's going to go out and condemn your house. And by the way, not only are we giving you the service of food, but we're going to tell you how long your driveway can be, how many hours you can work, what your wages can be. We're going to tell you we're going to regulate your life in any way we see fit. And if you don't like it, you can leave, but we're going to take whatever bite out of your ass that we want. And if you don't like that, then you're going to have to fight the cute guy with the buttons around on his apron. That's what government does. That's not what Applebee's does. It's not analogous at all. And you don't pay for government services. Your tax bill has zero correlation with your tax usage or tax benefits. I've said it before. I spent this year, I've made more money than I ever have by like almost a factor of 10. But I don't use almost any government services. Almost any. I mean, even like my power and my housing and everything, because all of it's paid for by an oil company that they give to me. I mean, they have their own generators, literally, and they make their own roads largely. I drive a little bit on the roads. A little bit. Not much, but all the electricity is held. So I will literally go months at a time and not even touch a government utility or government service. And yet my tax bill is higher than it's ever been before. Higher than at times when I was driving and walking on and using government facilities all the time. Higher than when I was going to a government school, either in high school or in college. I mean, when I was in high school, I had a job and I was paying less taxes, even though I was using maybe 20, 30, 50 times more government services. So it's not, and this is a side issue here, but the whole claiming that it's a government service, that's another enormous conflation. You know, it's kind of like calling the taxman's theft, highwayman's robbery, taxes. Calling the goods and services that governments give you service is wrong, because for something to be a service, both parties have to agree.
If I go and say, will you mow my lawn, I'll pay you $20, and you agree and you mow my lawn, then you did a service for me. If I wake up one morning and you're standing outside my door with my lawn having been mowed without my knowledge, and you say, you owe me whatever, no. That's not a service because I didn't ask you for it. I didn't agree to it. What that is a unilateral demand for money based on an arbitrary, also unilateral action on one part. So, and the most common example here are the squeegee men. You know, they come up, they squeegee your window, and all of a sudden you owe them money. No. All right? Government does all this bullshit. Most of it is not even remotely, by some stretch of the imagination, a service to me, because so much of it is military spending. So much of the rest is for what they call education, but what is in fact enormously wasteful bureaucracies of indoctrination that do much more to retard actual education than they do to help it. Welfare programs that perpetuate and incentivize dependence and foolishness and sloth, and arresting people for non-crimes and then forcing me to pay for their room and board. None of those are services. Even the things that I might want at some level, like roads from here, you know, there are some roads I drove on, but I don't feel like I should have to pay for all roads everywhere. I feel like I should pay for the roads I drive on, and I should pay for them how much I drive on them. My grandmother, who doesn't drive hardly ever, who walks most places she goes, should not pay the same for roads, roughly speaking, as a truck driver who spends 18 hours a day driving a 40-ton truck all the time. Their tax bills for the roads are not that dissimilar. That doesn't make any sense. But even more than the fact that they're not correlating your bill with your services, and again, we have to find a new word for that because it's not a service. If both parties don't agree, it's not a service. Or at the very least, it's a different degree of service that has much more moral and ethical and economic validity. I mean, we know, for instance, in economics, if two parties agree to a transaction, then at least ex ante, both parties think that they have benefited. If we have a unilateral transaction where one party agrees and the other doesn't, well, the one party has benefited, but the other party has not. So the net social utility is either neutral or negative. Whereas if they both agree, it's obviously positive. So it's not payment for services. They don't consistently apply their logic here. They make a huge fallacy right at the beginning by just assuming the very thing that's under consideration. And then they have the smugness to make a joke about Somalia in most cases. So social contract is completely bullshit. The government, and here's something that I should have mentioned earlier. Contract implies that there are obligations on both sides. So we could say, okay, there's a contract between you and the state, and you're obligated to follow the state's rules. That would mean the state is obligated to do something too. Guess what? The state's not obligated to do anything. By its own say-so, it has said this. It's not obligated to protect you. I mean, what's the number one thing? To protect you, right? From criminals or from foreign states. It's not obligated to do either. It's not obligated to give you an education. It's not obligated to give you roads. It can just say, you know what, we're not going to have your road anymore. And they can just do it. They can just, if it falls into disrepair, they don't have to fix it. You can't say that they breached contract, but the demand on you remain, regardless of the services the government gives you. So you can't have a contract that's binding on one party and not binding on the other. You can't have a contract, implicit or otherwise, that's unilaterally negotiated and altered by one party. You can't have an exit clause that is completely up to the discretion of one of the other parties. So I know people think this is some kind of rock solid argument, but it's actually kind of laughable. So, all right. I'll see you next time. Oh, also, I'm thinking about going to Pork Fest. I'm about to finish work. I think I'll have time. Does anyone have want to encourage me? I'm kind of like, I don't know, but we'll see. So if anyone has anything to say about that, and you watch this far in the video, then I'll know if you make a comment about Pork Fest that you did.